Good evening. Welcome, everyone. So good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm Grace Law, Chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD. I want to begin with a quick reminder that we actually have live captioning available tonight for our virtual audience. And to enable that option, you need to click the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the live stream window. For our in-person audience, live captioning is available at the link or the QR code there. And please visit the AV booth if you need assistance. Next Thursday, I just want to make a very quick announcement that Thursday and Friday, February 15th and 16th, Gary Hildebrand and the Department of Landscape Architecture will host a two-day conference entitled Forest Futures, Will the Forest Save Us All?, alongside the GSD's new exhibition with the same name, Forest Futures. So I welcome you to that event next week as well. So I was thinking a lot about tonight, and as you know, we are very fortunate to have at the GSD to receive a number of distinguished architects, designers, and theorists from around the world. Last semester, our speaker series brought to this podium a variety of global perspectives from Japan, Italy, Lebanon, Belgium, among others. So it's really very exciting to welcome this evening's speaker, an American architect whom I deeply admire, Marlon Blackwell. Marlon joins us from closer to our home here, but if no less kind of foreign, actually, culturally, Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he leads his practice, Marlon Blackwell Architects, founded in 1992 with his wife and partner, Mariati. So some years ago, James and I had a chance to visit Fayetteville. We were reviewing student work and lecturing on our practice at the University of Arkansas, where Marlon teaches. And we had the opportunity to see Marlon's work firsthand, for which we felt a kind of kinship, as ours were practices operating outside of the coastal architecture scenes, and instead from the context of the Midwest and the South Central states. So nestled within the complex cultural landscape of the Ozarks, Marlon himself describes this setting as a place of real natural beauty and simultaneously of real constructed ugliness. His practice has been described as contextualist, referring to the vernacular while transcending mere regionalism, towards something that is at once familiar and inventive, sensual and scrappy. And unifying eclecticism and pragmatism, he produces an effortless contemporary architecture that feels distinctly American in its optimism and resourcefulness. So for this enduring impact to the field, he was awarded the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal in 2020, the Institute's highest honor. Marlon's newest monograph, Radical Practice, released in 2022, celebrates his 30 years of practice, spanning an architectural acclaimed body of work that he has grown progressively from modest origins. Starting at the domestic scale with projects like the Honey House that were published in his 2005 monograph, Architecture of the Ozarks. This small project was about light, the refraction of light through honey, and then projects like the Keenan Tower House, which soar above the surrounding treescape with a kind of figural expressiveness. Since then, Marlon's projects have taken on greater complexity and scale as they assume the responsibility of a civic presence and engage a much broader community. These later projects can be read as elaborations or advancements on earlier methods and tectonic systems, exemplifying an approach to practice that nimbly adapts to different scales and varying contexts. Indeed, what I believe ties Marlon's work together, all of the projects across this incredibly prolific career, is this deep attentiveness to place, to local climate and materials, as well as to clients frequently overlooked by others. Andrew Freer of the Rural Studio has praised Marlon's ability to see extraordinary opportunity in the most difficult circumstances. Through his expressive profiles, attention to materials and tactility, infusion of color and light, I might extend Andrew's thoughts to suggest that Marlon makes vivid the 1800s adage by Anglican priest and historian Dean Stanley, who suggests that the call to greatness is not to do extraordinary things, but to do ordinary things in an extraordinary way. In an era of narcissistic exceptionalism, this architectural stance might produce an unexpected theoretical syllogism that refreshingly connects conventionality and radicality. Perhaps this is the underlying current behind the title that he chooses here, Radical Practice, which could be understood in two ways. On the one hand, it's impossible to disassociate the term radical from the movements of radical architecture in the 1960s, Italian work of Superstudio, Archizoom, and others, or from, let's say, notions of political or social reform, all of which connote experimentation or extreme change or opposition to the norms. But on the other hand, we could understand the word radical in the medical or botanical sense, which refers to arising from the root, as in a radical leaf that grows immediately from the root of a plant, not from its stalk. This latter form of the word provides a double meaning through which to consider Marlon's work. That is to say, it is simultaneously progressive and rooted. This ethos is perhaps why Marlon states in his own words that architecture can happen anywhere, at any scale, at any budget, for anyone. In an early project that we had the chance to tour, he transformed a metal shop into a place of worship, including the repurposing of a satellite dish plastered over to serve as a sanctuary dome. This project, St. Nicholas Eastern Orthodox Church, exemplifies an economy of means for a maximum of meaning. And at less than $100 per square foot, it is rumored to be the least expensive building to win a national AIA award. So Marlon cleverly manipulates conventional construction and materials to produce, time and again, a distillation of light, form, and space. Even as a prolific practitioner, Marlon remains a committed educator as the Fay Jones Distinguished Professor at the University of Arkansas. He has been named one of the 30 most admired educators by Design Intelligence, and as our John Portman Design Critic in Architecture this spring, he brings his pedagogical expertise to the GSD in the Translogic Studio, a proto-urban vertical monastery, which seeks to foster an architecture deeply rooted to its place, responsive to its environment, and constructed with an attention to material culture. As we've come in the recent years to a kind of fulsome suspicion of the consequences of a globalized world, we may feel compelled to react by scrambling back to the vernacular. As if to remind us of a different path, Marlon's approach offers a more nuanced way forward in asserting a kind of worldly presence while remaining attentive to the local and impervious to stylistic whims. As an educator, an architect, and a storyteller, Marlon imparts a wide breadth of impact about which we're very fortunate to hear today. So please join me in welcoming Marlon Blackwell.
Wow. Well, that's an introduction. And it also literally was my introduction too. So it's great. I'll get to talk fast because I don't, Grace wants me to move quickly. But it's great to be here. It's great to be back in Boston. One thing that I didn't say is that I actually, in my formative years from 1985 to 1990, lived here in Boston, worked here in Boston. In fact, my old roommate is here, Greg Shaw, shows up, yay. But good to see some old friends and familiar faces here. Actually got my first teaching start here at the Boston Architectural Center. Realized I had a lot of work to do, and I wasn't very good, but kept trying at it, and now this great honor and privilege to be here at the GSD this semester with a great bunch of students working on a wonderful project in Mexico City, so where we'll be headed to next week. But yeah, I think in many ways Grace sort of captured what about this idea of radical practice, because I kept running into that. It's like, well, you're from Arkansas. How do you talk about radical? And I think absolutely the sort of 14th century medieval use of the word, the adjective verb, as radical, as something to deal with root or rootedness, and really proceeding or from roots as a way to affect change, a kind of fundamentalism in a way that is very much a process of transformation we're often engaged in through the fundamentals and through affecting change in the places where we work. And I think the place is really important because in Thoreau's words, heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads. And I'm always try to be mindful of that. And when we bring together sort of disparate understanding or forces or observations of situations in a place, we like to call these abstract unions. And very often where I'm working at, abstract unions are found in a place of unholy unions that encompass really our approach and helps us address questions of practice versus theory, of engagement versus, say, detachment from the world, and questions of form. Now, frankly, most of our work occurs in places where detachment isn't even an option, even if we wanted it to be. So Ati and I, rather than see abstraction as a removal from reality, we really think of it as the process of connecting to place, generating a productive tension between the local and the global, I like to call the glocal, and looking for possibilities of using an economy of means for a maximum of meaning. Here, 1 + 1 never equals 2. We're always looking for 1 + 1 to equal 3 or 5 or 7, really to create the value proposition in our work in this effort it takes to be resourceful and working with very little to emplace architecture in places that you would least expect to find it. We're a firm now of 25 very talented folks based in Fayetteville, as Grace has said, and over the last 30 years we've been working on a variety of building types and scales of buildings, everything from a carport to a new American embassy in the poorest country in the world, in the Central African Republic. So it's just a map to show how we've begun to spread out and work from this national and international, but really always thinking about vocabulary, syntax, grammar, how we speak through the fundamentals of architecture, space, material, and light. And for us, place is the canvas, and architecture is the medium, and it's shaped by the forces of nature and public life, in particular to local form. I like to say we do work that's in the place, of the place, for the place, and sometimes necessarily out of place. That's the way it works. But here, place is defined as a tangible representation of that intangible society that lives within it. I like to call this placeness. And to make an architecture of placeness, I think it's necessary for us to embrace everything, even the bad things of a place, to get below the surface, to the underbelly, so that we can understand these things and incorporate them in who we are and what an architecture of the place, in the place, and for the place can be. So often, this is really a transformation story, and I like to think of every project we're working on as that. I had something to say about this slide, and I thought, I'm just going to keep moving. I will say this, I was a wrestler, that's when I was coming up, and I did have to wrestle a live bear one day in Colorado for practice. It's a long story, and I can tell it over drinks later. But anyways, when you come into our office, you always confront the bear and the existential question of, are you prepared to take on the bear? So nonetheless, payback is hell sometimes. So as a good Southerner, I should start with a story, I guess, in some ways. So this story takes place post-war in northwest Arkansas, in Fayetteville, with a family by the name of Fulbright. And they owned a mill, and they made farm implements out of local white oak. You've probably heard of one of them, Senator William J. Fulbright, and he was a progeny of that family. And what he began to realize is that over time post-war, the demand had dropped, and they started building up a huge inventory of these implements, and he's getting concerned both for the business and what to do with this material. So he had a good friend who was also a childhood friend from Fayetteville who was practicing out of New York, an architect who was quite well known at the time. His name was Edward Durrell Stone. And he was building the first fine arts complex on an American campus at that time. And so he went to his friend Ed and he said, Ed, we have all of this material, all of these implements, and I'm really at a loss as to what we could do. Do you have any ideas? He said, let me think about it. And he came back a few weeks later and says, here's what we can do. We can take these implements and modify them into an international line of furniture. And that can start a new business revenue for you, a new form of business, and also populate my new complex. And so wagon wheels became stools, plow handles became chairs, and let's see if I can get this going, big plowshares along with the traditional craft of Ozark basket maybe became beautiful chase lounges. And these were just, tables, all sorts of. And so it created a whole new revenue stream and a renewal for the business. It had a major impact locally. But if you go today to New York to, say, the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, you will find these very same implements. Just to illustrate to you that the impact that can have in a global or more universal way. And that's really all we're trying to do with architecture, is to find that productive tension between where we are and this larger conversation, larger discourse globally. And so, in effect, the new develops out of the old, but the old, however, is changed in the light of the new. And we're always mindful that we operate between the ideal in the discipline and the more improvised. And we don't see these as a plus minus or our task is to resolve one to the other, but in fact to try to find resonance between these conditions with the things that we make. And in the same way, in the discipline, we also have these situations in the culture. On the left, you'll see Thorn Crown Chapel by Fay Jones, where I think we've taken just about everybody, Grace can probably attest to this, that comes to visit. And I remember taking the first person ever come to visit was Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Muron many years ago, and then Peter Zumthor and Robert Irwin and others that came, and I always take them, and they always have, no matter what their mindset was, a really visceral reaction to this beautiful glass chapel in the Ozark Woods, because it's architecture of the highest order. Now, it's in Eureka Springs, about an hour from where I'm at. Across town in Eureka is another icon that we like to call Milk Carton Jesus. And he was designed, he's part of a tourist attraction called something about the pilgrimage, where actors act out the life of Christ. And they built Jerusalem there out of plywood, and this is pretty cool. But they designed, Christ to be quite tall, like in Rio, really tall, and could be seen from everywhere in the hills. And as they were erecting him, they were informed by the FAIA that they would have to have a flashing blue light on the top of Jesus's head, which was, they didn't want that because of the flare. So, but rather than redesign him, they just cut him off at the knees and pushed him into the ground. And so he has a proportion of a milk carton. Anyways. My point is not to denigrate one or uplift the other, it's just to point out this is the reality. And again, we see this in an inclusive way as sources of inspiration in the way that we work. And we like to kind of engage the everyday, the things that I would say is what the world gives to you, the world as it's given to you, and then finding ways to represent it back to the world. And so we find operations of ways of resituating local form into new forms and new types of architecture that may be related programmatically or not, but that have something that's strangely familiar. Again, back to that productive tension. And as a former cartoonist, which I did all the way up through college, I only recently in the last 10 years discovered that almost everything that we do is sort of sectionally and really thinking of architecture as a visage. So the fugitive nature of the profile and the silhouette is very important to the work. But part of that is because we're working in places where there's more space than form. So we work in the round. we have to design every facade, not just an infill. So we're always thinking about how it presents itself against the horizon. So I'll dive into some projects. The first project is one that Grace brought up, and I think it sort of embodies a lot of what we're about. So this is the St. Nicholas Eastern Orthodox Church. It's a congregation, a small congregation, worshiping in Springdale, Arkansas. And they were worshiping in a pretty rundown office building, not very dignified place. They have a very aestheticized form of worship. And they were desiring a new sanctuary and fellowship hall. And one of their parishioners died. And so they took the money that she left and they bought 3.5 acres next to the interstate. And the money they had left over, they wanted to build a new sanctuary. And so we went out onto their site, and they had about $100 a square foot to build this. And they said, I asked them, well, how do you want to approach this? And they go, well, we think the best idea is to take this old welding shed that's on the site and turn it into the church. And I said, you mean like tear it down and then build on the footprint, right? And I was like, no. I mean, we only got $100. So and it's like, my heart just sank, you know. And it's like, what to do? But we did what we do a lot of projects is go do the research, go back to the origins. And we thought, okay, what is it that we could do as an architect that wouldn't cost anything or cost very much? And proportion and scale are relatively free. And so we went back to the origins of the Greek proportioning system, the origins of the church, looking at early churches and chapels and such, and using this proportioning system kind of reconfigured the whole metal box into this new box metal, this new kind of sacred figure that captures all of the icons, the colors, and then we threw in a little bit of Corbusier because I believe that everything goes better with a little Corb, and this makes this new church. How did we do that? Well, we took the existing building, we left it as is, essentially. We wrapped it in a new box rib metal skin off the shelf. We then added 10 feet to the front of the building to create a narthex that could get you back on the east-west, the traditional east-west axes, with movable walls that open into the fellowship hall that also can expand during overflow services. So pretty straightforward. And then we carefully coursed everything. So with a fidelity to craft and thought with this ordinary system, we customized our own transitional details to get the maximum level of seamlessness we could get in the transitions. Even the doors are, coursed, the windows, quite precise. You can see the concrete pad that tells you where the exit door is. But really trying to elevate it, cut one window in the existing building to get some morning light. The iconostasis is made out of angle iron. But one of the things they really demanded was a dome. We couldn't put it on the building because we had pre-engineered structure, so they allowed us to put something underneath. They couldn't afford a dome. The contractor couldn't afford or didn't know if he could build one that would meet our standards. So he had a friend of his who loved beer, lived out in the country, about 20 miles away, that we traded a couple cases of Budweiser for. And here you go. So he gave us a satellite dish. And so we took the satellite dish, brought it in, skim-coated with plaster. It's got its own natural lath, jacked it up on a scissor lift, and we have our dome. So that's how we roll in Arkansas. And I told Father John, I said, this is fantastic. Now you have a direct connection to God. And he informed me it was kind of pointed in the wrong direction. But nonetheless, as Grace said, we got a call in 2013 to inform us that this had won a National Institute Honor Award, which we were really excited about. And they said, we were really impressed with the budget that you built this for. So we went back and did some research, and they did come back and said, we believe this is the least expensive building to ever win a National Institute Honor Award. So it really underscores what we've been trying to do for the last 30 years, which is to demonstrate that architecture can happen anywhere, at any scale, at any budget, and for anyone. It should not just be reserved for the few. It should be accessible by everyone. And I think this project certainly proves that. So this idea of taking our local material culture and using that as a kind of way to intervene is happening now in a new project at a much different scale, a much different budget. This is the Whole Health Institute. This is not it. This is something not going to be. But the Whole Health Institute on the Crystal Bridges campus in Northwest Arkansas. This is a national preventative health institute that deals with life management, well-being, as well as Art Bridges, another national institute that is committed to getting museum or art out of the museum basements and into communities, is all part of this complex. But the way in which we started was trying to find a way to make a connection to place. And one of these things was our cash crop in Northwest Arkansas is stone. We have a lot of stone. We have poor soils. We have great stone. And so there's a whole set of vernacular buildings, both houses and churches, that we call giraffe stone buildings, giraffe buildings. And so we sort of began to think about how we might use this as a building material for an institute, and sort of begin to abstract this local stone that you find in the fields and such. It's kind of easy to obtain. And then using this in some ways as a sort of a foundation for conceptually thinking about this as a relationship between the cave and the forest, which is a big part of Northwest Arkansas. So this is the campus of Crystal Bridges Museum. This is the Moshe Safdie Design Museum, bridging over the creek. There's a new medical school being built, college about preventative health, and then in red, you see our two buildings on the left, the whole health, and then an 800 car parking garage that had to be built because this was displacing parking surface. So you begin to see the building as it curves and begins to gesture around the existing ravine to create an event lawn, as well as greet people with this dog trot that goes through the site. It's really a type of extended threshold through the site. The upper part is all developed through a series of pre-weathered brass fins, a brise-soleil on the east and west side here. So you have the base, you have the top, and you begin to see how the ravines help create the responsiveness of both the garage and the whole health institute in their forming and shaping. And then creating a variety of porches and thresholds in the campus. So this is where people first come onto the Crystal Bridges campus, and then the community porch here, all the offices up below, all the event and public spaces on the ground level. And so the material strategies are quite straightforward, taking the analog of the tree, the fins, the vertical striations of that of the forest, but then translating that into pre-weathered brass fins, and then manipulating the edges of those fins to reflect light and shadow and create a kind of kinetic device as they move along. So this is the mock-up, full-scale mock-up that we've been working on, test the stone, to test the brass fins, but this is the effect we'll be looking for. And here, kind of the flickering, so it pulses with the forces of the nature across the day. It's currently under construction, so here the wall is awaiting the stone, and then the copper, the bridge is flying over. The stone, it's never been done at this height. It's 19-foot tall height. We've done a lot of mock-ups using rope joints and really carefully selection mix of stone and also shaping of the stone to get what we're after here. But this really will begin to enliven what's below. And then once you move inside, that stone translates to a stone floor, but then the forest is actually pecan ribs that's 3NC milled, on the computer to kind of create the canopy and the datum for each one of the spaces here. So this is the entrance here, but even up in the office area, that datum of pecan sort of establishes the relationship, reciprocal relationship, and then a series of offices, open offices, and conference rooms are sandwiched between. And so this is under construction now. Like I said, it should be done by the end of the year. It really becomes about an intersection between art, nature, architecture, and health. And that is kind of a new thing for a museum campus to expand into architecture and health as part of its mission. And my parting shot here of the piece that's under construction at the moment. Now, its companion piece is a parking garage, which is really just supposed to be a parking garage, but we threw out to the owner, we said, well, what if it were more? It's right on the edge of this playscape, goes down a ravine called Convergence, has a plaza. Brian Haynes' studio out of Philly, landscape students, architecture firm is doing that. So we came up with the idea of a proscenium that where art performances and art can happen, and people come through the garage and through the proscenium, and then a glass bar down below and a retail shop and other things. So we really start to program it. Again, 1 + 1 has to equal more than 2. And you can see its relationship to the plaza and how it receives the landscape, both going down and coming back up. can kind of get a sense of how that works. So it really is like a big catcher's mitt at the end of that. One of the things that we've been working on material-wise to give specificity and identity for very little money is working with Sherwin-Williams in PPG codes, automotive body paint. They have every code of every paint that's ever been done in the automotive industry. And so this is my grandmother's 65 Pontiac Tempest, Agua Azur. So we customize paints, and if you're using a lot of metal, it costs very little. And then we use gold metal flake or silver metal flake based on Dale Jeffries, who kind of invented this with sports cars and race cars back in the 50s, and we tested out with that. So the whole building is all automotive body paint, which is very resilient and really comes alive, especially with the different light during the day and at night and with the sky and such. But this will become fully, it's got some of the first bits of sculpture and stuff in it now, the lighting. It'll come online fully in about a month and a half right now with the new bar. So we're often working in strange contexts. I think in Middle America, you often find you have something that approaches urban, and then there is the rural, and then there is the annexation that starts to create conditions like this, where the ruburban, so to speak. And I'm somewhat biased towards what you see on the right, this, again, the silhouette, against the horizon and landscape that really, for the most part, doesn't exist anymore. We were approached by a doctor, a pediatrician, saying, I need a new office building, and I want to locate next to other healthcare facilities in this suburban condition in Rogers, Arkansas. And we need a new identity. We need something that kids can identify with or identify, and we need something more dignified for them to come to, their families, but also for my staff to work in. And so we, decided to intervene in the land of beige, which is usually what I like to call suburbia here. Everything's beige, I don't know, shades of beige, I should say. And we thought, there's so many buildings here in suburbia where they have 15 or 16 different geometric formal moves on them with maybe 15 or 16 different materials. I mean, before you get out of the car, you can count all this stuff and you know that something's not right. So we decided to make a building that had one form, two colors, and one material, and see what would happen. So rather than dialing it up, we dialed it down. And this is the pediatric land, our new kind of suburban subspecies of architecture, so to speak. And so this is the south facade. None of the patient rooms could have windows in them according to HIPAA, so we had skylit rooms along this edge, but creates a real primary figure, easy to identify with. We worked with the staff to pick colors. It could have been red, silver, green, blue. They picked the orange red. Here, it's really made for cars going by at 40 to 50 miles an hour, but also for folks on bike or pedestrians as well. So as you're driving by from the south, this is what you see. The Brise Soleil facing east for the reception area. These are all spec office buildings, medical offices down below. And then, but then as you go by, everything switches. So you have a kind of more local landscape, and then it becomes this kind of pewter gray. So the idea is it's more of a sign in the landscape, but it has a split personality. And we like to play with that. But this was really something that was born out of its suburban condition. And then it's porte cochere, so it's designed for the car as well. So you pull your car in, you let the patients off, and they come in to the lobby and then make their way up a grand stair that's skylit with blue light from above that kind of creates this little sense of wonder for them, and they kind of move through that light, which is constantly changing over the course of the day, into an almost zen-like reception room, very different from most pediatric clinics that you go into. They're absolutely chaotic. But each space gets their own skylit, natural light into the space. And as well, for the nurses, they too get natural light, both views and light from above, as well as the doctors. This is the doctor's lounge with its mezzanine up above where they hang out during appointments and surgeries. And so the staff get their own private entrance here. They have their own porch. They take their meals and such. And then the pop-up is where the doctors hang, and then the foot, of course, is where the patients go. So, and it's actually been a building that's been a huge success for him business-wise. as well as for as an identity or as an icon, let's say, in the community. And its new nickname is the WTF building. So it kind of goes both ways, I guess. Now, the transformations of everything from material to buildings and such also can apply to a landscape in a campus. So we've just finished a project last year in Detroit, Michigan, in the 6 Mile area called the Mary Grove Early Childhood Education Center. And this is a really special project on the campus of Mary Grove College, traditionally an African-American liberal arts college that has basically failed. It lost enrollment, got into financial trouble back in 2016, and was really going to be a huge detriment, let's say, to the McNichols-Livermore neighborhood, this traditional African-American neighborhood, which is really what had been the nerve center for it. But fortunately, the Kresge Foundation came in and decided to repurpose the entire landscape and turn it into a cradle-to-career landscape. From the time you're born till you're 20 years old, you can go to school here, and it's built for about 1,000 people, 1,000 students. But the cornerstone of this would be this early childhood learning center from prenatal all the way to kindergarten, because that really is the cornerstone of education, lifelong education. If you get that right, the kids have a really great chance. It's a 20,000 square foot building that couldn't be vertical. It had to be 1 story. You can see the collegiate Gothic traditional buildings as part of that campus. We inserted a mat building and then introduced a series of courtyards to provide light into the middle of it, but also controlled play and work areas as well, and then a kind of organizing the wayfinding throughout the building around these courtyards. This is the neighborhood, the campus. You can see the single-family homes that sort of engulf the campus here. So it really is center to life there. And I think one of the things that was really important to the community was to have identity that was representational for them. We did not do the civic engagement. That had to be done with a third party, with folks that had the street creds to engage. But we got information back, and one of the things that we got back from them, from the folks here in the neighborhood, is they didn't want a monochromatic building. They didn't want another stone building or brick building or all metal building or whatever. They wanted something polychromatic, something that was really represented their desire for diversity, inclusivity, and such. Now, I got to talking with the vice president of Kresge Foundation, Wendy L. Jackson, and I was thinking, you know, it's terrifying. I don't know if you've pulled a lot of color out into a building, but it's one thing to be inside, it's another thing to be outside, especially when your only color is red that you work with. But so talking with her, she's like, well, try to think of this as somewhat like a quilt, like a patchwork. And I said, oh, you mean like the quilts from the quilt ladies in Gee's Bend in Alabama? She goes, yes. I said, well, I've been there many times. She goes, well, so have I. I said, well, so, and if you don't know who these ladies are, they're pretty amazing. They take discarded cloths, discarded rags, and stitch them together into these useful and beautiful works of art and artifacts in such that they're now displayed in MoMA, but also you can just use at home. And so that's the sort of approach. I went and met with and saw the Petway family, who kind of runs the co-op there in Gee's Bend, and just asking questions, looking around. That really formed the inspiration for this patchwork of ribbed glazed terracotta. And so we're having to work with the existing stone buildings contextually, but also introduce accents in color. And each color costs money, so we had to be very careful about how many colors we did. We did 150 different palettes before we landed on one that was acceptable. But then once we do that, we find ways to treat windows and doors and such as spatial propositions, to grab light from the side, from above, from the front. So this articulates that facade. The wall leans in for your entry. And then as you go inside, you come to your first courtyard. That's your focus. To the lobby on the left is a coffee shop for families. On the right, community spaces for different organizations in the community as well. And you begin to see how these work as vitrines for light and for meetings and for play. Every classroom has direct connection to a courtyard, so they can improvise, they can take learning immediately inside to the outside, so it's a classroom in effect as well. You get to see how that works, and again, a control place for play. Again, you're talking prenatal all the way to fourth, or to kindergarten. And every space, even the corridors, we carved away for places to sit, socialize. Here's their reading library nook carved out of that hallway as well. And then community spaces where community groups can visit. So when a family, when they drop their child off, they don't have to go. They can stay. They can have a coffee. They can do work. They're really part of the center here. And these spaces also bleed off until the south side, which is on the neighborhood side, this particular case, where we have a play landscape that's Margie Ruddick designed, which is absolutely beautiful. It's woven between this existing grove of trees. And then at night, it becomes this sort of beacon in the neighborhood. So people come, when they come, they come from the neighborhood and they can walk through all the way onto the other side. So there's sort of the local and the more visitor entrances. And about a year and a half ago, I went back to Gee's Bend, and the building had just finished, and I had some photos on my phone, and I was there just to see what sort of quilts Miss Petway might have. And then I said, hey, by the way, the inspiration y'all had for us, look what it produced. And I showed her a photo of the building, and she sort of looked at it. She goes, well, you just given me an idea for a quilt. So it kind of works, in a circle somehow. So I'm going to show a project that I have not shown before, but happens to be here in Boston that's currently under construction. We're pretty excited. We've been working on it since 2021, along with Studio Gang, Henning Larsen, and MVRDV, and have gone through a series of presentations and approvals by the BCDC, BPDA, and HALC. I guess we'll just call it HALC. Everybody knows them for better or for worse. But it's been great in getting their feedback and input. This is known as the Enterprise Research Campus, which is across from the Harvard Business School. It's located within the Alston Landing North neighborhood of West Boston. And it's really revitalizes, this campus does, a former industrial rail yard into a green, pedestrian-friendly hub for creativity, exploration, and research. The campus contains a conference center and a research lab by Gang Studio, as well as another research lab by Henning Larsen. And then you'll see in the green there the housing towers by MVRDV. This has 25% affordable housing, which is the largest ratio that's happened in Boston in a long time. There's also a greenway that basically connects the neighborhood and the campus to the river that's been developed and designed by Scape, landscape architects. And anchoring that northwest corner is the ERC Hotel, which is our project, a 240-room lifestyle hotel that's 16 stories tall. It also has mixed use in it as well. So the ground floor features restaurants, local retail, cafes that outline the edge of the campus and then frames the entrance to the greenway. So that's a bit of an introduction to the project. You can begin to see, let me see if this even works, but I'm gonna, yeah. So there we are in here, right here. So this is the first part that's being currently under construction. You can see how the greenway works this out all the way back to the river. It's really I think going to be a spectacular public way for the city. And then zooming in along Western so in many ways we sort of saw this ensemble that we were given. We walked in, it had already been master planned when we were brought on. And I sort of saw the master plan and the way things were arranged and their massing as like a still life on a table. But so that's what we were given, this sort of the table and tower scheme. But we were really interested in establishing frontality along Western. And so we found a way to get rid of this idea of table and tower and just make it one thing, a frontal piece, then activating the ground floor. So now it's a very specific figure, and activating it with all types of business retail, but letting it touch the earth very lightly. And then shape to the skyline the context of the figure, so it begins to take on an identity, and then enhancing the streets through the landscape in a series of porches and clefts that people can interface with between the laneway and the different landscapes. So here you see the sort of portrait in the still life, and then these views that you get from up top across to the skyline of Boston, back towards Alston, and then across to the campus, which will also be building up in that area, which is currently a zone. So here's just the basic simple elevation. You can see how it begins to work with the massing along Western Ave, but just a very simple figure. And the idea is to, this is the north side, is to take the daily life of the hotel and expose it to the city. So all of the activity that's happening with the guests and so forth, in closing curtains, opening curtains, meeting the sun, Life of Brian, all of that stuff, all can happen along that north side, and then wrapping it on three sides in a beautiful, illustrious sort of aluminum cladding system that's slightly scalloped and curves to create a kind of, again, an exaggeration of shadow over the course of the day. And these are the different porches and clefts, so as it comes down, it creates, again, places for shade and shadow. Where you find shade and shadow, you usually find people, and that's something that we've learned pretty much wherever we go. But articulating the street, the hotel entrance here, so you can begin to see how these different rooms are sort of activating the street along Western Ave, and then along Cattle Drive, back towards Alston, another porch and cleft, and then that view from Alston. And then at night, that really gets activated too in the sort of kind of stripped down, and these are reveals. These are that are reversed, so there's no mullions. It's the reveal is actually goes into the building rather than out front. And then there's a bar up top and all that good stuff. So anyways, that's under construction, and it should be pretty cool. It should be a great place when it's all said and done. So working in that was, by the way, our first urban building. We've never done an urban building, so we're trying. We've never done a tall building other than a little tower once. But we also work in more places like this in the suburban places. In this case, a golf course or golf community, whatever. But we had a couple who were 70 years old, and they wanted to downsize into their dream house, which would be a courtyard house in this neighborhood. The neighborhood I couldn't speak too highly about because it has all that stuff I really detest, but we had an opportunity to do a really nice house. We don't do a lot of houses, but we developed a scheme that, just looking at the old Roman courtyard house, so to speak, out of brick, that works with this sort of tilted landscape back to the woods. So they wanted this more formal entry, so we began to make it as sort of an exercise in figure and thickness along this northern facade here to grab light from multiple areas and really set up the entrance, and then even create this frontality through the textured brick. Then on the inside, that thickness is explored, so you get to actually inhabit the thickness here. So really, we're sculpting and carving that wall. Once you penetrate that wall through this entrance, this formal entrance here, and you can see the building is just floating just above the earth, so it's just a little gasket of space. So we really wanted to create a kind of tension between sitting on the earth or being disengaged from it. But as you come in, everything works around this really beautiful courtyard. Everything is programmed around it. And sectionally, you can begin to see how it takes the idea of the courtyard, but then begins to adapt to the landscape, which is sloping back towards the south. So we actually complete the courtyard with a bridge, an outdoor bridge that is really a terrace and porch as well, as you can see here, and really becomes a really great place for a party, I gotta say. But you can move underneath, and of course we're in Arkansas. We're trying to create places for shade and shadow, coolness, and you can get to see being on the bridge here, looking back, sort of kind of interior lantern. And then as you move through, the whole expression of the house begins to move from the kind of, how do you say, very controlled windows and to the public, but as you move back into the woods, it really opens up to become a whole nother expression, so another kind of split personality house that transforms and is really governed by the land and the forest beyond. So another aspect of what we do, and I have a bunch of projects, but I'm only going to show one tonight that deal with this issue of ennobling the prosaic. We've been trying to, as I thought Gracie said it beautifully, trying to do something ordinary extraordinarily well, and that's really often our mission in these simple projects that we get. This is a project in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a new mixed-use project, but the owner, who I met in Detroit, who's been working with Quonset hut systems, wanted to try it out here in Fort Worth, where he's from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. His name is Philip Cockes, really great developer there. This is typically how you see a Quonset hut. It sits as a single object in the landscape. Light industrial, sometimes people might live there or whatever, but this is typically what you get. So we had an opportunity to develop more of an urban scheme. And so this is has housing, has offices on the bottom along the street level. There is a restaurant, public plaza by Julie Bargman with dirt, and then a new kind of vegan ice cream shop. I've never seen such, but it tastes pretty good. And then a local gallery and bookstore. So that was sort of the components of this. And we were really inspired because we're in Fort Worth, and we have this opportunity for these beautiful Quonset huts and a cereal deal, and it was hard to avoid the obvious a mile and a half away, as you see on the upper right. But we thought, well, we're going to ennoble the prosaic, though. That's different. But did our research and found out that Kahn had been looking at the stockyard buildings in Fort Worth all along, so he beat us to it. But nonetheless, this is, you see it going up. Everything is prefabbed, comes out of Steelmaster out of Canada, and a hut goes up in a day and a half once you have the foundations and everything built in. So it was great to see how this come together, and just really, once it come together, be really quite beautiful. Now, the curveball that we threw into the project is that we were looking for a more consistent vocabulary between these one-story buildings and these three-story buildings. And so what we decided to do is flip the Quonsets on their side to turn them from structure into cladding. And that created some really amazing opportunities in the horizontal corrugation of how you introduce windows when they're no longer tied to the structure in such a way. We began to animate this whole street edge, like this window here that kind of puckers out from the side. So it's a kind of eccentricity that we were able to develop. And then as you walk along the sidewalk, you literally look into the kitchen of the restaurant. You can see the chef working and so forth. So really the way to kind of urbanize the situation too. This is Julie's public plaza and the walks between, all made out of recycled stone and using pond cypress and cypress, really reductive palette. Most landscape architects I know use it like walls or screens or edges. She uses these trees like jazz notes in the way in which she distributes them over it, which will eventually be a type of forest in the urban condition. And then the other building, again, figuring out how to make openings. We had to kind of come up with different forms of detailing for windows and for doorways and cutouts, so forth, to create some depth and relief in these, but it really made for an interesting detailing exercise. Let's see if here we go. Along the alleyway, you have the people live up top. Each of these are a separate unit, and they have their porches on the west side, along the offices down below. And it's kind of, I love this tough scape. This is great. We didn't shape that tree that way, but it works out pretty well. And then inside, very simple, just a simple open space barrel vault, and then a plywood center, service center in the middle with your stair, your bedroom up top, bathroom, kitchen, mechanical. You're set, all set to go, all out of plywood. And the interstitial spaces between these, again, Julie's taken into account, and now they're being populated. These offices are turning into retail as well as regular offices, like a new barber shop that just got put in. So the community is really starting to embrace and enmesh itself. And that was the idea that Philip had, is give public space. Don't fill it all up with the private development. Develop your pro forma so you're always giving something back to the community. And I think he's done a really great job here in visualizing this. And then this is our rear window moment where we got everybody to raise their shades. Probably the only time that'll happen, and then flood it with light. It's quite nice. So another project that really is about the specificity in some ways of a place I'm calling interplace. Not far from Fayetteville is Bentonville, Arkansas. I'm sure you've heard about it, headquarters for Walmart. There's a lot going on there, design excellence program, a lot of investment by the Walton family, a whole new rethinking because they're in competition with Amazon. Amazon has thrown its lot in with the urban. The Walton family's thrown their lot in with the rural, and we'll see who wins. But they're fighting for talent, they're fighting for quality of life, all of that. So it's also, Bentonville is the #1 mountain bike destination in the country right now. It's like the mountain bike headquarters of the U.S. And so we had an opportunity to do a new ground-up building for WeWork. It was a collaborative team working with WeWork's head of architecture department, Michel Rochkin. I'm sure you know of, noted architect from Mexico, along with his team of Christian Callahan, Haruka Rucci, James Slade, Adrian Real, a host of other folks. And we were really excited about this, that this could be, this 200,000 square foot building about 5 blocks from the town square could be the first bikeable building in the country. And we got about halfway through it, and as you know, what happened to WeWork, it kind of imploded. And so they sort of divested from the project, and it was taken over by the developer. And then Michelle and Christian and Haruka, they formed different architecture teams, and we all just collaborated together and just kept working. And so we worked primarily in the core and shell, and then Christian and Haruka also did all the tenant fit out. So this is a building that you can bike to your 6th floor office if you wish. You can walk. It has a series of public plazas or terraces along the south and north side, or under the shade as well. So that activates that. So it really becomes it's a co-office working environment that also is about mobility and well-being, and you can begin to see how that works. Stefan Sagmeister also got involved with it as well, developed a whole series of interventions along the ramp. And it really becomes a kind of interface that creates its own place between the exterior and the interior. So the exteriority really inscribes itself on the interiority and vice versa. So you start off on the backside where there's a public park, and then you sort of wrap around and up the side of the building. It's all less than 1 to 20, so you don't need any landings or such. You can see the bugs, these beautiful glass tile bugs that he came up with. And then you come up onto the different ledges along the way. Wonderful art piece, these beautiful shingles by Ned Kahn and Stefan Sagmeister. Parking garage as well that we did. And the beauty of this sort of massing, this zigzag, is that the byproduct of it is that 6-story building feels very minimal on the streetscape. It doesn't tower above because it's constantly stepping back. And then that creates this sort of gasket of space between the trays of offices and the stepping here that you run into. So when you're down at the street, it feels like almost like a 1 or 2-story building, which is really important to this small town of Bentonville, that it not loom per se. And there's a dog trot through, and then here's that, again, that interface between interior and exterior in the lobby area. And then seeing the mobility, I mean, it really is what you look at. You have views, and it's people moving back and forth, and it's quite exciting. And here you can see it too. This was, I think, on opening day. A lot of people here. But really exciting, has been really well embraced by the community, and it's filling up fast, and then pretty exciting. So what we've attempted to do is manifest the culture and allow the culture itself, the local culture, to begin to shape, in many ways, the ideas about public space and form for this particular office building. So the last project I want to share with you is something we've really dedicated ourselves to, both public and independent schools. I think one of the most impoverished building types in the country are schools, maybe next to healthcare in some ways. This is a really special school. It's an independent school. It's a maker school in Bentonville. Anyone can go here. It's tied to your family's income. So some people pay $500 a year. Some people pay $25,000 a year. And they've been a huge success. It just sort of all came online a couple of years ago. It's called the Thaden School. The person you see in the plane there is Louise Thaden. You may have heard of Amelia Earhart. This was a colleague of hers, also a pioneer in aviation. She grew up in Bentonville, Arkansas, learning to fly planes through barns. She was a barnstormer, and then had a great career out in California in Kitty Hawk. And she's the muse, the inspiration for an idea about roots and wings, to be rooted, to have roots, but then have the wings to fly, go anywhere you want. There are 3 signature programs here. Again, it's all project-based. It's called Wheels, Reels, and Meals. Every student gets a bike. They learn how to work on bikes. They learn how to fabricate bikes. They learn about biking culture. They drive up the building, you know, the Ledger building a lot. And then there is Reels, where they learn to tell stories through animation and film. And then Meals, they have productive landscapes where they learn how to grow food and then learn how to prepare food and cook food. They have testing kitchens and all of that. So everything is through making. So you're learning about physics, chemistry, literature, all of that through the synthesis of these different programs. The site is a 30-acre site, used to be the old fairgrounds, not far from the downtown Bentonville. Obviously, we're not looking at, you know, Quad City or whatever for inspiration. We're, you know, how to master plan this. We're really looking at farm groupings locally, chicken sheds, how they, you know, work with the environment for breezes and sun and so forth. And that really helped us think about this not as a series of buildings and classrooms, but as one big classroom, the whole landscape as well as the buildings themselves. Collaboration, master planning wise, with Andrew Pogon out of Philly, landscape, as well as SQ Dumas Ripple, who did the home building here. So we're looking at different types of indigenous plantings, how people circulate. They wanted everybody to walk outside and cross the campus, no canopies, nothing. Water management, the whole terrain using MEMA mounds and such, the programming, as well as community geothermal. And all of that works together as a way of learning. So they have a learning landscapes too. So they're, again, all this project-based idea that happens in the classroom also happens into the outer classrooms as well. So this is a kind of overview of what's been developed. It's a series of buildings that are made primarily out of box rib metal with a little bit of FRC and then plywood roofs. The home building by SQ Dumas is an all-wood building, as well as the bike barn. So the Reels building is for humanities and arts, as well as the animation studios here. Again, we're working with one-story buildings. What we're doing here, though, is trying to create difference in each classroom. So every classroom is sectionally different, is spatially different, not the kind of uniform seriality that you often see in schools. We're using an operation called pitch and roll, which is basically how you got an airplane, but we're doing that in the roofs to begin to split the roof, to get light into it, to begin to scale to the different programmatic needs of the building. This one flips up at the end here. There's all chapel-like spaces down below for the different offices and collaboration space. But the animation and film, they also get to, this is a community lawn, they project their films onto the building. They have hooks with a screen that can be attached to it. And this is also where part of the Bentonville Film Festival takes place now. So it's, again, they're trying to find ways to integrate the community. There's no security fence around the school. It's an open campus, very, very important. And two, getting back to what I was talking about earlier with Sherwin-Williams and PPG, we're looking at this relationship between what's culture-made and what's nature-made, and it's finding the kind of relations there through Osage prairie grass. One of our favorite cars is a 67 Shelby GT Cobra in its green gold phase. So we actually got the recipe for that automotive body paint for the building and with gold metal flake, and we tested it out multiple times. And so now this is our Shelby GT here as a building. And really works well. I mean, it's always changing over the course of the day, has a lot of gold metal flake in it, reflecting light, but the landscape and it merged quite a bit. In these linear buildings, we're cutting crossways through them, cross axes, to create a series of dog trots and porches for transition, but also these are learning spaces too. The kids get out there and do their assignments with chalk and stuff in the spaces out of the weather. And again, people come and they go into the most social spaces, which happens to be the hallway. You can see in a horizontal building, it becomes quite vertical, letting daylight in. All of that's just regular plywood. You see no lights in the ceiling. Everything is uplit or integrated to just really feel the material, the different sectional ideas in the classrooms, all with direct connection to the outside. And then by pitching and rolling the roof, we can modulate its scale. So as this gets closer to the boulevard, it begins to scale down with its brise-soleil as well, and buffers for sound for the student lounge. Now, its companion building, which is on Main Street, it's called the Wheels Building. And this had to have some sort of, by the Design Excellence Program, some sort of engagement with Main Street. So what we're doing is creating a screened porch that shields from the sun, but also gives kids a place to pull out their bikes and tools from the bike shop to begin to work on. They have a civic engagement program on Saturdays to work with local citizens and fixing their bikes. The south side is a productive landscape. It's where they learn how to grow the food. And then in the home building, they have the teaching kitchens. And the inside is similar, with a similar palette, but now the spaces that you see, the interstitial circulation spaces, they become project labs, and the output of that is actually displayed in these series of columnar vitrines. Excuse me. And bike shop, and then opening that up. Beyond, you see what is now the performance building for theater, music, and drama, choir. It was something I designed while I was at the Academy back in 2019 in Rome. So it has a little bit of Rome, and it's got a 300-foot long loggia. Rather than putting the building in the corner, we put a space in the corner, a public plaza, and then this becomes this sort of urban edge that currently is missing in a lot of Bentonville. So it suggests how one could begin to develop this for bikers, for skateboarders, pedestrians. It's quite an active place. And there is really no lobby for this. The teaching facility, so the porch is the lobby. Not to be outdone, it is the work of a 71 Camaro instead of green gold, we went gold green on this one here with its one big oculus, or Google Eye, I should say. So the rake of the building is shaped by the rake of the auditorium below, or beyond, I should say, and then by the porch here. And so, again, this is the lobby on the left, the porch. As you go in, you kind of go off to the drama, music rooms on the left, or slip in to the slot to go into the auditorium. The stage is ground level, so you can make all their sets in the wood shop, which is where the wheels is, the bike shop, wood shop, robotics. And then they wheel those across the campus right onto the stage seamlessly. So it's kind of nice. And then inside, it's all articulated with local red oak plywood. And we wanted one window, one connection with nature, with light. And so this window basically is a kind of figure setup, an interior figure of soft troweled plaster, hand troweled plaster, kind of bends the light around, connects you to the outside, but creates a nice display of light and warmth into the space. And then outside, a really nice, beautiful expression of the window, a different figure acting as a kind of backdrop to the activities in the landscape. Last building, they had to have a bike barn. So they are called the Barnstormers, after Louis Thaden, and their mascot's an owl. And so the headmaster said, we have to have a barn for, a gym, and, for our pump track, they have a bike pump track and such. And so they wanted a barn that was like a real barn, kind of off the grid, that breathes through its skin, that ventilates. And so I told him I'd been working on this barn for about 30 years. So I finally had the opportunity to kind of rethink the traditional gambrel Ozark barn into this beautiful cypress siding with copper screen behind it that breathes in between the boards, with next to the pump track, a series of ventilating dormers that pop open that allow breezes to come underneath. All the doors move, so it turns into really a kind of giant pavilion. It's all naturally ventilated. And it has this nice porch here for along the soccer field, bikers to get out of the sun. We didn't have a lot of money for this, so I had no money for mass timber, which is like the thing now. You got to have mass timber, or you're just not cool. I'm joking. I think mass timber is great. Anyways, what we did was we used a mass of timber. And so we just had a local truss manufacturer gang nail a bunch of trusses together. here and make this really simple, beautiful structure. And you can begin to get a sense of this sort of pavilion-like nature of it here. And then just using our brains a little bit, how do we develop the articulation of the stair and the mezzanine? We just take 2x4s and cut them diagonally, rotate them, back screw them, and there's no waste to speak of, and it fits right in with the rest of the kind of lightness of the pole barn and girts. See underneath here, and again, this fidelity to craft, getting everything to line up, including the lights. As the sun sets, during the day it's opaque, but our lighting designer worked with us. So as the sun sets, it begins to the light slowly come on and becomes somewhat translucent. And then as the sun sets over the horizon, it becomes transparent and this sort of icon for the campus and a little beacon in the community. And with that, thank you very much. Yeah, I did go an hour, which is longer than you wanted, but sorry. It's okay. I'm not used to talking that fast.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Wow, what a treat to see all of those projects explicated even further. Actually, you can look at them in so many images, but not actually see, when we hear you talk about the material palettes, it's actually very, very revealing. I know that many of you might have questions, so I do want to turn it over to you, but I thought I'm very curious. It's hard for me, let me see if I can think through this. So you are working with very thin metal skins, which on many buildings have a tendency to make those buildings appear thin and or flimsy. And yet the massing strategies, you're leveraging the kind of simplicity of the massing strategies to, and the abstraction of that to essentially create a uniform exterior palette from which your apertures are carved in very specific moments. So I don't even know if there's a question here, but I'm just thinking about the way in which you're working, because on the one hand it's a form which is carved, on another it is very clearly a layered thing, but then through color and through keeping the wrapper very consistent, you're making something that feels very monolithic, which is very surprising for that material palette. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the process that you're working with, because in some ways this is almost like a meditation on what you can do with corrugated panels. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had to find the right panel first and foremost. We had to find the right panel first and foremost, which is a Morin box rib panel that's, again, it's somewhat, how would you say, corrugated. So if you look at the figure ground of the panel, it's almost 50-50 or 60-40. So they kind of work together, the reveal between the panels. So finding that, and then just creating transitional details. If you get a kit of parts for these metal panels, they come with their own, and everything is like 10 times the size it needs to be. So we're do those transitional details. I think that really helps. But we've been talking in the studio and so forth. I think I'm trying to avoid the sort of the sort of trope of the architecture is understood as a sort of a glass box or translucent box in which you then put a screen over, that sort of thing. And it's like that's one strategy, and that's a kind of more Miesian thing, whatever. But I'm sort of after kind of revisiting thickness, even though we build in layered systems these days. You don't get a chance to do a lot of stereotomic kind of things, at least where I'm at. But starting to look at thickness and carving and the interstitial zone in that, and figure. And so we've been talking about it in the studio as an architecture of the, rather than the fast, how would you say, thin and explicit, something that's more thick, slow, or an explicit, something that's more thick, slow, and implicit. And so trying to get one to linger a little bit longer in it, to inhabit the space, to see these elements and windows and things that we're doing as extensions of space rather than, just cutouts and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what's driving it a little bit. I don't think we've ever done a complete project that way, but you can see some of the exercises.
That's very helpful to hear you talk about it that way. The other thing that you mentioned, which I was so intrigued by, you were talking about the fact that you're working with shape, shape versus, let's say, form versus space, or in your case, particularly in the rural contexts, the kind of pressure on this abstract quality of shape seems to be something that is very present for you, and maybe is producing this. In that same way, though, you could also ask whether or not the tendency then would be to inherently produce a kind of object-like building that in a way, it's almost difficult to divorce those two things. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, there's a primary reading and secondary reading. So the primary reading might be of the the gestalt of the primary figure, but then the secondary, tertiary moments of that's where the carving comes from, and the porches in your carving in or projecting from, right? So it becomes sort of the main body, and then you have these little mutations, right, that you begin to work with. As a former cartoonist, what you're doing is you're operating in a reductive manner to use the least amount of marks, an economy of marks, to maximize expressive character, right? And so the same way with buildings, all I'm trying to do is economize and optimize the expressive character of the building through its silhouette or profile. But then as you move around it, you begin to understand that there's more to just the frontality, right? It has to, as I've been told before, that alone can't carry the project. So there's all these other aspects of things, material, a space, this now interest in thickness, how we start to deal with that in some form. It all starts to layer onto this.
Right, and it seems to me that the material palette that you're using, when you see, for example, like the quality of those plywood ceilings, I mean, we can see that they're not. this is not like A-grade plywood. I mean, you're seeing the football patches and everything else, but it's very interesting because where you're very careful then is to for example integrate the lighting and or be very precise. I mean, the roofscapes are unbelievably clean and gorgeous.
Yeah.
And so you're actually working with all of the other pieces of the infrastructure,
Right.
And you're not relying on that material palette to manage or conceal
Right.
those systems,
Right.
but you are actually very much laboring to control the position of and the outcome of that.
Right. That comes from teaching for years in comprehensive studio at Arkansas. If anybody else teaches that, God help you.
Core 3. Core 3.
but traditionally that sort of approach, which I learned, its source or it is in technology, and I would put a counter proposal to it that it's really about interscalar relationships, and so it's about integration. That's what the conference. It's not all about the technology. It's about how you develop scalar relationships between the scale of the city, the scale of the building, the scale of the hand, the detail, and how do you integrate those systems into that so that the primary reading isn't disrupted, by strange diffusers and baubles and lights. So we're trying to remove all of that by integrating it, and I think and so we privilege the material, and the space, and the quality that light can give a space, either uplighting or diffuse lighting. If you go to, like we're going to go see in a week when we go to Mexico City, the Casa Barragan, you don't see any lights hanging from the ceiling and stuff. Everything is uplit, is dealt with in a different way. There's a real reason for that. You want to understand the space. So that's what we're doing, and so that's how I teach it now, and I teach the comprehensive studio. Technology is one source, but it's not the source. It's really about how you integrate and how you use things like proportion and scale and again, the joint to put things together.
Terrific. Let me open it up and allow you to ask questions. There's so many. There's a microphone right there so we can.
Hi, Marlon. This seems to be a little bit different from the kind of work you did here in Boston. Can you describe how your work here influenced what you do now?
Oh, that sounds like a trick question.
You're talking not about the current Boston hotel, but you're talking about Boston years ago.
Boston.
You're working.
Well, I think, well, it was funny. I worked for some good firms. I never really worked for a firm I truly wanted to work for, but I worked for them because I was of the mind I was going to learn something, and I did. I mean, I'm just being honest. I worked, I performed a job. What I learned most, though, was how to edit, because I didn't go to graduate school until after 10 years of practice. So, by the time I went back, I was the Dick Clark of architecture. But it came to me as I was designing, it's like what I've learned over all these years, all the grumbling, I'm not getting to do the kind of projects I want to do, but I had learned to edit and I'd learned to manage my time, and that's what I learned from that. And then I also learned, there was a guy named Chris Koyos at CBT who always pushed back anything I put forward. He says, I bet you could do that in 2 materials instead of 5. He was always like pushback. And then another fellow, he would never allow me to show a 2-dimensional detail. He was this Israeli guy, and Ami, I think was his name. He'd always just throw it back. I don't want to talk about it. I said, bring it back in 3Ds. So he learned how to detail it 3-dimensionally. And that, too, was a lesson I've never forgotten. And so, especially now, of course, we're modeling details. That was by hand. Today, we do that naturally with a software system. But the idea is to really understand the detail as a spatial proposition. And that's what he was after. And so those are the kinds of lessons I learned a lot. I don't know if that helps. Yeah, okay.
Another question.
Thanks. I really like some of the work that you showed. When you were talking about the Bentonville project, you talked about how the culture influences the design. Can you give some examples of that? I think you did in a way, but...
Well, I mean, that's a huge biking culture. We've got 70 miles of greenway in this little place that they've invested in. The bikes, races, everything. So the whole place is, outside of Walmart in a way, and eating, I guess, but is bikes. So the idea that we could make a building that you could bike on and that would actually shape the building was, and also an extension of public space, right? From not just being on the street, but diagonal and up in the air, and just kind of an exercise and that. So we're kind of, questioning that a little bit. But you're looking for other examples, I guess. Oh, well, off the top of my head, I don't have anything. I can talk about, well, I guess I can talk about it. The agricultural part of things. So the chicken industry, a lot of people can, about that, but I look at the common sense of, the chicken farmers and how they orient their buildings. They're almost always east-west. They're long linear buildings. Why do they do that? Minimize the sun on the east and west, maximize breezes along the south. Chickens don't cook before their time. But that kind of common sense thing to me, is pretty important to kind of flip that back around and allow that to influence what we're doing, not in a tongue-in-cheek way or anything, but in a kind of commonsensical way. Where I'm at in the Ozarks, if you really want to understand where we're at, I always recommend reading Emerson's Self-Reliance. It's a really good read, short read, but it starts to explain the kind of resilience and do-it-yourself kind of nature of this culture, which has been, and only until recently, primarily subsistence farming and relatively very poor. It's only, in the last 40, 50 years that it's actually had a real economy. So those are the kinds of things that influence. I also just think that folks are willing to embrace the ordinary if it's done well. In fact, it's kind of like Boston. When I was living here in Boston, they said Bostonians don't really show their gold. I don't know if that's true, but there's is that true? Sort of, I don't know. But, they're not flashy here. That's the kind of, in the Ozarks, it's not flashy, You see people, some of the 8, 10 wealthiest people in the country live in our area. You would never know them. So the same thing with the architecture. The architecture, if they see it's common, you're not gilding something. They see that as a kind of maybe good use. Yeah, there is a kind of modesty or humility, I would say, in the culture. And so that's one reason I think I've stayed there because, it's what you can do with boxes. And so we're just, because boxes I can get built, but they don't have a lot of tolerance for other things. So, hope that helps. I don't know.
But I would say though that you're also painting them red. The what the fuck? I mean the WTF building. Sorry,
You fell for that.
Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's
The
all right.
you refer. Sorry,
Yeah.
you refer to the WT. Now, that's actually drawing a lot of attention to itself. It's intended. It's intended
and
to
thus the
not
name.
be.
Yeah, and thus the name.
And thus-
yeah,
and thus
yeah.
the name.
So I mean, look, we did silver, we did green, we did all these colors, but he really wanted. So I think kids connect with. He's a pediatrician, and he deals with well-being and preventative health, all that stuff. And so it's like we put him out there and said, here, But we were thinking of the building as a figure, suburban figure, an abstract figure in a landscape of unholy union, so to speak, right? And so this idea that it could be a type of billboard as well, and without actually making it a billboard, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, we're putting some things out there like that, but they're controversial. Some people hate it, some people love it. I mean, the way I got the WTF, I was happened to be showing somebody around. I was in the reception, and there was a woman there paying her bill. She goes, I don't know what to make of this building. I have to come here and bring my kid all the time, but, I just call it the WTF. What the fuck is this? But I like it, and so it's like, so I mean, I was like, okay, I'll steal that from you, so, yeah.
Other questions? Mark?
Hi, thanks so much for your lecture. So one of the things that strikes me about your work is that many of the clients you work with are clients who maybe, for example, with the St. Nicholas Church community, are not typically approaching architects as part of their daily work.
Right.
And I'm curious about how the initial conversations with those types of clients happen. Are they people that are approaching you? Are you seeking out types of clients where you think there might be a project to tease out, or is it something in between?
I think it's something in between. We actively seek out. We do pro bono work, at least one project a year. So a lot of times there are projects that wouldn't be a project unless you get involved in some way. I didn't show a free health clinic, we did, but we helped them. We designed something, got a price for it, helped them write a grant. They got the money, got it built, and it's been transformative, for their institution. We do that. We're kind of soft-hearted a little bit. We just finished working on a Yopon tea processing plant in Clarksdale, Mississippi, that couldn't be built. It couldn't be built because they couldn't even put the infrastructure in the existing building for the budget they had. And it was sad to kind of work through that. And so there's some wins and there's some losses when you're working in that area because it's very unstable and uncertain who you're working with. But I think I like the kind of clients that we get. A lot of them haven't worked with architects. A lot of them don't know what they want, but they know what they don't want. And they don't want what everybody else has. And that's a good place to start. And so that's kind of where we start. But we don't talk a lot about what it looks like or anything. We talk about what it does. Again, back to being in the Ozarks, it's got to perform. I've got to talk about performance. I've got to talk about use and those things. And then what it happens to look like, the church, there isn't a parish meeting a month they have that somebody wants to put a big Byzantine dome on the top of it because they're like, wow, where's our Byzantine dome? And so you are challenging them to a certain degree. But part of that, and the reason we want to deal with a variety and diverse amount of projects, it's not about always profit. It's about trying to put the purpose before the profit in some ways. But it's also about providing alternative models. Because where I live, most folks' benchmark for reality is measured by what they're surrounded by. So as a designer, if I put something that expands that reality, I've opened up new possibilities, right? Not only for them, but for the next designers or architects that come by, right? You start to change the level of expectations. I've seen that happen firsthand with this museum, Crystal Bridges Museum, that no one thought should belong in Bentonville, Arkansas, one of the great American art museums, and it's free. And to see people from all walks of life that you'd probably never see in a museum, in bib overalls and stuff, in the museum, just in gobsmacked and in awe. That's a cultural transformation that started a discourse and a conversation in our community that without that could have never built the building in the red, because that was a discussion as well about art, about being part of the larger discussion. I hope that made that, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Their limits.
we hit their limit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Appreciate it.
Marlon.
Thank you.